And so I ended up leaving, in that hospital room where I was at in the jail. And then I ended up going back into my cell and, made a decision that I was going to hang myself. I was facing the wall and I was kind of hugging the little makeshift pillow that I had, and I was crying. I'm like, God, you know the truth. You know what's going on. I'm not even capable of doing anything. God, please help me. Like, if you're really that God and you're really the God of miracles like that, would you do a miracle in my life? Would you please help me? Please help me. And as I'm praying that prayer, I heard an audible voice say, go get the medical records.
Today's conversation under the fig tree is with a gentleman I have known for several years. I'm calling him Eric. That's not his real name. And he has an incredible story of an incredible God who also gifted him with an incredible brain. Eric didn't grow up in church. As a matter of fact, his background is not a traditional one, and God was not really even in his thoughts when at the age of 20, a meth lab blew up in his face and left him completely blind. A few years later, after he had married and had 2 children, his life took yet another dramatic turn, and he tells that story in detail today. On the surface, his story seems ludicrous and not at all fair the way we think fair, but the end result has been absolutely mind-blowing. At this point, Eric has received several degrees, has several years of graduate studies already accomplished, is a field representative for his organization, and is embarking on yet another adventure in the next few days. By the time you will hear this podcast, he will be married to a wonderful girl, and they will be well on their way to another chapter in a life led and orchestrated by God. But oh my goodness, his way has not been an easy one. Listen to him as he tells you part of that story. It's great to see you, and it's good to have you on the Fig Tree podcast. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You're one of my favorite people. You have a great story. God's done so much for you, and just so glad that you were able to be here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and always great to see and talk to you, and absolutely one of my faves too. So
yeah,
amen.
When we get going, we can actually take up a whole lot of time because both of us have a whole lot of words, and we enjoy hearing, I think, our back and forth banter. So
absolutely.
So you have a lot going on right now. I think in less than a week, you will be married, and that's exciting.
Absolutely. She's a good woman too.
I'm so happy for you.
Yeah, I'm happy for myself.
We're thrilled. We are all thrilled for you.
Yes, ma'am.
So let's start at the beginning. You were not raised in church. So tell me a little bit about that background.
Oh man, my mom and dad split up before I was born, and typical, dysfunctional home, alcoholism, drug addiction, things of that nature. I was in foster home when I was 3, 4, 5. Come back home, was sent off to go live with my grandma, and come back when I was 10 or 11, 12. Ended up in some, trouble as a kid, got in a fight, and was off to institutions and youth homes and jails, and was like that all my teenage years. And, came back, started, getting involved heavily into drugs. And yeah, it was like that. And, was, I think probably from the time I was 18 to 21. Yeah, I think I was 21. Ended up incarcerated again, got out. And then when I was 25, ended up incarcerated again. So I'm blind. A lot of people know that, but, but I'm blind because I had a meth lab blow up on me when I was 20. So I started making meth, and when I was 18 and did it for those years, and then ended up going to prison as a result of cooking dope later as a blind person. My mom caught wind, that I was out doing it. She called the task force on me, and I ended up arrested, was looking at 45 years in prison. And mom, that was the best thing that she ever did for me. And so, I ended up going to prison. I got 6 years for that. And then got out and was, that was really the time where I made a decision, really. I made a decision that if I could live so hard trying to destroy my life, that if I put that energy in trying to live hard that was destroying my life, what would happen if I took that energy and made it, started to be positive? Would go to school, would, try to get an education, would try to, do something to better my life. What would happen then? And so that's what I was doing. I was trying to go to schools, college, wanted to be a drug and alcohol counselor. Was going around to schools, talking to kids about the hazards of doing drugs, and was really trying to get myself together. And so, I ended up getting out of jail. I was living my life. And my wife, we had, two kids at that point. And my daughter was a month old, and my oldest boy was 18 months old. And so, I was trying to go to school, to college, and she was working. And so after she had the baby, we kind of went through this process on, who's going to take care of the kids, because we couldn't afford the childcare. And I was like, well, I mean, I can. Well, why don't we see how it goes? We'll start out with an hour, 2 hours, and then work up to however. And so, and I was there taking care of, the baby while she was there. And then we started out 2 hours and 4 hours and then, 6 hours or so. And she's never really gone more than that, 6, 7 hours or so. And, and I was changing diapers and, wiping noses and, bottles and all that other stuff. And, I was a pretty independent and very willing, blind person, very capable. So that's what I did. And then, she went to work and, she had to work 6 hours that day. And I was home alone with the kids and I guess I don't really know how far into detail you want to go, but the reality is that if I don't really tell all the details, then people really won't understand what happened. And then if people don't know what happens, then they usually fill in the blank with whatever their imagination can come up with. And I don't want that. Right. It's important for people to know the truth, but if people don't know the truth, then people don't really, they don't really have the ability to appreciate what God did for me. So, if that's okay, I'd like to tell the details.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I was home alone with the kids and, and I just got done feeding my daughter, and my boy, I guess is the oldest, but he was over by the filing cabinet tearing up a piece of paper. And I thought maybe he'd gotten in there. So I put my daughter down and I set her catty corner in a lazy boy chair. Like a lot of people set their babies up, in a corner of the chair and just kind of prop them up and things like that. So no big deal. Went over and go deal with him. He had an envelope. The filing cabinet was locked. So I just gave him back the envelope. We'll go ahead and tear it up. That's a big deal. And then I go take care of some other things around the house, and I come back and I sat down in a chair right next to my daughter. Well, when I did, I sat on the bottom part of one of her legs. And, she cried, and it scared her and it scared me too. And, and I immediately called, Jamie. She was my wife at the time. And I sort of was like, hey, come home. This is what happened. And so she came right home and, she looked at Cadence and said, there's nothing wrong with her, Matt. And I'm like, we're taking her to the hospital. She wasn't crying or nothing at that point. No big deal. No bruising, no swelling, no anything. No indication whatsoever that she was even injured. So I she's like, I don't think we need to do anything. She's fine. I was like, we're taking her to the hospital. And so we did. And we were really concerned about, her being injured and me being home alone with the kids blind, not because I did anything wrong, but I'm home with the kids blind and, what would they think of that, And so, so we lied, said that, that she was home and upstairs and, that Eric was the one that climbed up on the chair on her, and we didn't think anything of it, other than the fact we were only trying to hide that I was home alone blind and caused the injury. And so when we got there, they did an x-ray and they said that she had a small fracture in the bottom back part of her leg. And that, they didn't think that, a child climbing up in the chair on her could cause those injuries. They took pictures of her, no bruising, no swelling. She left the hospital, no bruising, no swelling, no anything. But what's going on behind the scenes is several things. One, a year before, there was a guy that was all strung out on drugs, and there was a couple, and she had a baby, and the boyfriend was all strung out on drugs, and he ended up killing her 3-year-old daughter due to physical abuse. So that's what was going on. And then here I come asking questions. They're doing research on who I am, found out that, we had this history. And so now they're thinking this baby got hurt. This guy's a drug addict. We need to protect the kids. And so the response was these injuries were consistent with child abuse. Now, that's a very general statement, but that's all that needs to be said in order to remove the kids from the home. So that's what happened. They took our kids, put them in foster home, and I ended up going to jail. And I had a warrant for, like a fine that I had years ago, but we ended up paying it. And, while I was still in jail, I asked to talk to the police who investigated the case. And I went down and I told her the truth about what happened. I set her in the chair and I sat down next to her, and this is the result of what happened. And it wasn't a big deal. So thank you for being honest. Maybe we can work through this, and, it really won't turn out to be that big of a problem. And so I ended up getting out, and it was, we were moving forward. I wasn't expecting any kind of criminal charges, and, but we still had to deal with the issue because the kids were in foster care. And Child Protective Services and foster care is a much different situation than criminal care. Of course, they have much more freedom to do all kinds of things. And so they forced paternity tests on my kids, which was a humiliating thing for us to go through. They demanded a polygraph exam, which I took. And I was really shocked because they said in the beginning that I passed it, but the guy failed me because of the way that I acted. It was really confusing to me. How do you pass it, but then you fail somebody because of the way that they act? It didn't make sense. But I knew that I was telling the truth, so I wasn't really all that concerned about it. But, as time progressed, they acted like, they said that she had a skull fracture and that these injuries were way worse than we first, thought. And that they said that her leg fracture was a spiral fracture. And I'm like, how in the world does her injuries get progressively worse? That's not what she was diagnosed with at the hospital. And so as the heat began to press her up, I ended up, took some pictures of a monkey in the chair because I'm trying to fight for my life at this point. They're claiming that she had these injuries, and I'm like, how in the world did she have these injuries? Did it happen after she left the hospital? Because the doctor at the hospital diagnosed her with nothing but a small fracture in the back of her leg. It makes sense. And before I knew it, it was 2 months went by, and the police were pounding on my door, and they actually arrested me and charged me with battery on a minor and neglected dependent. And it was devastating to me. And I ended up in jail and was looking at 40 years in prison. And, the first time I ever had a paid attorney, my grandmother paid for it. And, he's coming in and telling me there's no way we're going to win. The doctor's saying she's got these injuries, and there's nothing you can do. And so his thought process was the best thing we can do is work out a plea bargain. And so he talked me into signing a plea bargain for staying home alone with the kids blind, and therefore I was guilty of neglect of the defendant. And then because of my past criminal history, I'd be doing 15 to 20 years in prison. And so, that was incredible to me, that I'd be going to prison for that long. But in my mind, I guess this is a paid attorney. I didn't have anything else. What else was I supposed to do? My grandma paid for him, said that she knew him and that he really looked out for him before. So what was I supposed to do? And so I just I was like, well, I guess I'll just sign the plea bargain, But I remember one time, that we could ask God to help us. Is what the preacher said last time I was on jail. And I didn't know anything about following God or anything like that. But I did go back to my cell and I said, just prayed. That's all. This is the only thing that I said. I said, God, if this isn't what you want to happen, please don't let it. And so, I was supposed to go to court the next day, accept the plea bargain, and I go to court, and they didn't take me over to the courthouse. That was weird. And then my attorney shows up right next to me at the jail. That's weird. And he said, Matt, I've been an attorney for over 20 years. I've never seen anything like this happen. They're taking the plea bargain that we agreed to off of the table, and they're going to take you to trial, and they're going to give you every bit of the 40 years. I said, they can't do that, can they? He said, I didn't think they could do that either, but they're doing it. And I said, well, what are we going to do? He said, I don't know. I've been an attorney for over 20 years. I've never seen anything like this happen. And I didn't know what else to do. But in the back of my mind, I did remember that prayer that I prayed the day before. And I looked at him and smiled. I said, we're going to win. And he looked at me and he said, well, you're an idiot. There's no way you're going to win this case. And so the next few months, he's like getting ready for trial. And, and then the next thing you know, it's just like every time we turn around, there's no way we're going to win. There's no way we're going to win. And I'm like, well, if there's no way we're going to win, dude, we need to really reconsider what's going on here. And we ended up firing this guy. And like a couple of months went by. My grandmother didn't want to talk to me anymore. So I didn't have any, other than my wife, I didn't have anybody else to talk to, and she's, steady fighting, and she's disappointed and upset, and rightly so. She's out there trying to take care of the kids on her own, trying to get them back out of foster care. Her husband's gone. Her children are gone. And that's all she was trying to do, was just trying to build her life. She was trying to do right too. And her being in a drug addiction, it was a mess for her. So, I really, for what she was going through, is pretty incredible. Very strong woman to be willing to go through all that and stay with and try to fight through. Yeah, really impressed. And, and as time goes on, I remember it was around the 4th of July, and I've been locked up for, 6-8 months at that time. And I remember hearing the fires going off outside. And I'm like, man, I should not be in here. I didn't do what these people are claiming that I did. And I mean, it just, all I ever wanted was a family. Like I told you at the very beginning, what I went through as a childhood, all I ever wanted was a family. And here I had one, and I was doing everything I could. I was doing everything right for the first time in my life, trying to invest in other people, trying to go to college and better myself. And then this is what happens. It was an accident, trying to be home, being a dad, and this is what took place. It was devastating. And so I ended up leaving, in that hospital room where I was at in the jail, and then I ended up going back into my cell and, made a decision that I was going to hang myself. And I just had a thought come across my mind. Well, maybe I should at least talk to my wife. And I knew she was going to visit the kids the next day. So I just purposed in my heart that I would call and tell them bye. And I did that night. I as I was making the news, because I was going to hang myself the night before, I just said, God, with tears in my eyes, I heard that you wouldn't put anything more honest than what we can bear, but this is too much for me. And I was like, that I'm not even capable of doing anything like this. This is too much for me. And, and I went to bed that night, and I cried myself to sleep like I always did. And I got up the next morning and, had my breakfast, whatever. And, my decision was I was going to hang myself that night. And as crazy as it sounds, I was really looking forward to it. I was just being in jail, tired of my life being as messed up as it was, and tired of even the system, the government, the judicial, just that was their solution to me, for me, was just to lock me up, throw away the key.
Yeah.
And so, 5, 6 o'clock rolls around. I end up calling my wife. It was, maybe a little later, 6:30, 7 o'clock. I'm calling and I'm talking to her, and I'm telling her, I love her, and I'm bi, and I'm talking to the kids, and, Christian wasn't born yet. She was pregnant with Christian at that point. While I was out, she ended up getting pregnant. So we were 2 kids and another one on the way when she's going through all this stuff. And so I'm talking to Eric and telling him, I love you. I did the best I could with what I had. And he was, he was 2 at that point, almost 2.5. And he didn't understand, but, he just, it was a mess. And as I was on the phone telling my wife goodbye, the door opened up and someone yelled out, "Hey, does anybody need to talk? We're a couple of chaplains, and we're here. And, if anybody needs to talk, we're here." And I was like, "Yeah, I need to talk." And so I didn't even say
Wow.
goodbye to my wife at that point. And I just turned around, hung up the phone. And I was like, I want to talk. And we had never had any kind of chaplain go through there at all, never anything like that before. And so they came into my cell and, we were talking and I told the story that I just told you. And they're like, well, their response was really kind of interesting. They're like, well, everybody's innocent in jail. And they said, we don't know what's going on, but we know a God who does. And, and I'm thinking, it's really kind of taken back. Well, I'm here spilling my guts to you. And that's your response, And, they said, we're going to pray and we're going to ask God to do something in your life. We don't know. We don't know what's going on, but we know he does. We know he's able. So they prayed for me. And I wish I could say that it was a miracle, Paul, Silas, Peter type deal. It wasn't that way for me. But the thing that did change is that I didn't feel like I was alone anymore. And so, that night, it never even crossed my mind that I was supposed to hang myself. And then the next day, another preacher came in looking for me. And that week, 5 more preachers came in looking for me. Never even asked for any
Wow.
of them.
Wow.
And so, and one of them was this little old man that was weird, and he would just read these stories to me and anoint me with oil. And he would just pray for me to receive the Holy Ghost. And I just knew that I wanted God, and these guys were coming in doing Bible studies with me. And, they got it where I could have a Bible on tape. So that way I could listen to the Bible. And so I did that. And then I was having Bible studies, not because I knew so much about the Bible, but it was my way of getting people to read the Bible to me. So we did this whole thing, and it was really cool, man. Like how, and and I just felt like, I wasn't by myself anymore. And several times a week, people would come in and visit with me and talk with me and things like that. And so that happened for a couple 2 or 3 months. And even though that was going on, I began to get depressed because there was just no hope for me. And nothing with my case. We fired my attorney. My public defender came in to visit me, and the investigator came in, and he's like, "Well, I just don't know." Da, 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 da. Like the more people were telling me that there was no hope, the deeper the depression got. But I remember hearing on tape about the God that brought prisoners out of the jail, and I read the verses. Well, he declares the guilty innocent. And looking at the time where, Hezekiah was surrounded and he made a little prayer, but so that the whole world would know, and I'm reading through the Psalms where David was troubled and afraid of his enemies.
Yeah.
And I read the story of Jonah, how he was swallowed up by a whale and how he would cry out to God and even the well would spew him out on the dry land. And so like, if God can have a big fish swallow a man and have him spew him out on dry land, God could do something in my life.
Yeah.
And so, that was my thought process. And, I remember leaving my Bible study that night and going into my cell, and I was tired, and, I was facing the wall, and I was kind of hugging the little makeshift pillow that I had, and I was crying. I'm like, God, you know the truth. You know what's going on. I'm not even capable of doing anything. God, please help me. Like, if you're really that God and you're really the God of miracles like that, would you do a miracle in my life? Would you please help me? Please help me. And as I'm praying that prayer, I heard an audible voice say, "Go get the medical records." And it freaked me out, man. I sat up in bed like, what in the world was that? My door was locked. I get up and check. No one was in my cell. Got my little cane, sticking it under the bed, make sure no one was. There was no one in the cell but me. And so I'm like, man, what in the world was that? But inside my heart of heart, I knew that I'd heard the voice of God. And I couldn't wait to call my wife and ask her to go get the medical records. And I did. I hurried up and went and I called her and I said, "Listen, Jamie, we got to go get those medical records." "What?" We got to go get the medical. For what, Matt? I'm busy. I'm working. I got parenting. I got the. And I'm like, Jamie, please go get the records. And it took her forever. It took her like 6 months to go get them. Maybe not that, but it did seem like forever. And she did. She went and got the orthopedic surgeons first. And the orthopedic surgeon was the doctor that she went to second. He's the one that diagnosed her with a skull fracture. So she goes there, she gets the records, and so I called her up and I was like, so what happened? What's going on? She said, Matt, I don't know what's going on here, but something's wrong. I'm like, well, what's wrong? She said, well, there's two reports. There's the report that she came to the doctor on the first day, and then there's a report that she came to the doctor a month later, and there's two x-rays. I said, okay. She said the report that when she came, he said that she had a skull fracture. But the report that she came to check up to finalize to make sure she was healed, it says she only had a leg fracture. And the x-rays here, there's two of them. Both of them are of her leg. There's no x-rays of her head. And I was like, well, what in the world's going on with that? We didn't know. And I'm like, well, go to the hospital. See what they. And she goes to the hospital, and they took two x-rays of her head, but there was no diagnosis of a skull fracture at all. And there was no CT scan or no MRI or anything like that, which is what you would expect if they thought she had brain trauma. Right. If there's a head injury to a baby, a 1-month-old baby, to create a skull fracture, they're going to make sure there's no injury to her brain.
Right.
They never did any of that. And so I'm like, he's the one that diagnosed her with a skull fracture. Where's the orders for the CT scan or anything like that? There was none of that. There's no records of a CT scan, nothing. And I was like, well, dang, go to the family doctor. Now, what took place that I didn't tell you at the very beginning was when I was out of jail and I was kind of taking pictures of the monkeys and was trying to figure out what's going on, we went to our family doctor because we know that she went there, right? The foster parent took her to there. And we know that he wrote a report, but we wanted to know what was going on because we were confused about the skull fracture. And so when we went there, before I was arrested, I asked him specifically, where's her skull fracture at? And it was because I was confused because I know what happened, right? There's no way she should have had a skull fracture. There was no injury to her head or anything like that. There's nothing like that could have even happened. And so he said, I don't know, in the back of the head somewhere. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know in the back of the head somewhere? Didn't you look at the x-rays? And he said, no, I didn't. I said, well, how in the world are you writing reports that are being used against me if you never even looked in the x-rays? And he didn't answer. And so Jamie's trying to talk to him and ask him more questions. I said, Jamie, it doesn't matter. He never should have wrote a report. He doesn't know. And so we ended up leaving the doctor. And so when she goes to the family doctor and she gets the reports and she's reading it to me, she said, Matt, you're not going to believe what it says in these reports. I said, what? She said, and she wrote down the date, the time, the person he was talking to, and he wrote down a phone conversation. And in it, he tells her, and it was a caseworker for Child Protective Services, he tells her, I never looked at the x-rays. I only went by what the foster parent had said. I don't know about anything of these reports. And I couldn't believe that he wrote those in his reports.
Wow.
But he did it to save his own hind, and is really what he's doing. He was trying to hide, because if he can't honestly tell what happened, he's subject to lawsuit. By putting in his reports what he wrote down, he's saving himself from that. But what we did is we had the affidavit to show probable cause. And the affidavit to show probable cause, I remember having it read to me. And in it, it said that all the information came from this caseworker. And so that was the reason why they had the affidavit, the probable cause to arrest me and charge me with the crimes that they were charging me with. So we checked with the prosecutor's office because we had the discovery on when she turned his reports over, and we compared them. And what it showed is that she knew that he didn't look at the x-rays, and that he didn't want to have a report that was being considered as evidence against me. She knew that for 2 days. 2 days after that phone conversation, she turned over his reports as though they were legitimate evidence against me anyway. And so that was a huge, huge problem, because really it's obstruction of justice. You can't knowingly and willingly submit, information that is false especially evidence like that. You're supposed to be a professional. You're supposed to be doing an investigation. An investigation should have integrity. And she's knowingly and willingly submitting evidence that she knew was false. So when we got all these reports, we gave them to the public defender's office, and then it blew his mind that this was actually happening. And so he said, well, this changes a lot. And I was like, I know, I told you that I was innocent. I told you she didn't have those injuries. Well, before it was just a blind man in jail saying that she didn't have those injuries, but now he's got documentation from the doctors who diagnosed her. And they've got huge holes in their case now. This is a big problem. So he used to be an investigator for the state as a police officer. Now he's working for the public defender's office. And so his response was, well, we'll send him to another institution. And so they sent it to a pediatrics hospital, bone specialists, and they had a whole team look at the records, just the X-rays and a picture of the monkey in the chair. And they looked at the X-rays and they said she had the same fracture in the back of the leg, and then that was it. There was no spiral fracture. He came back later and refuted that. There was no spiral fracture. He said that there was no skull fracture. And he went on to say there's no way you could even tell that she had a skull fracture because there wasn't enough X-rays of her head to make that diagnosis. And then because she was 1 month old, the bones would have been so soft that she wouldn't have had a fracture anyway. There would have been trauma to her head and to her brain. And the only way to know that is with a CT scan or MRI. And he said no doctor, if they would have thought that there was any kind of trauma in her head, they would have done a CT scan or MRI. There's no way that they wouldn't have. So the fact that they didn't shows that they never even thought that there was really any kind of trauma in her head at all. And then the last question was, could the injury happen the way that I said it did? And they came back and said, yeah, and in fact, it makes sense that it happened that way because there was no bruising, there was no swelling, there was nothing. They never casted it or anything. They never, no treatment to her leg whatsoever at all from beginning to end, except for over-the-counter Motrin. So it completely turned everything around. And they went from trying to put me in prison for 40 years and broadcasting me on display. Look, this is what we've done. This is what he did. And this is what we're going to do to him, to them completely turn the whole thing around. And I ended up walking out of there 2 years from the day, but it's about 2 years from the day. Got
2 years.
2 years.
2 years.
Yep. Yeah. It took a long time, so, if anybody's listening, it's really important that we trust God and wait, because 2 years is a lot better than the 40, that they would have given me. Yeah. And so even when it feels like God's not working, just because it doesn't seem like it, just because it doesn't look like it, doesn't mean that he isn't, because he certainly was.
Wow. And I want to be indignant and I want to be mad about the injustice that was done to you. But without it.
Yeah, that isn't all. I mean, when we found out that the caseworker, when we found out that the caseworker had did that, they were still looking at us like we were drug addicts, and these kids were just, they needed a new dad. They needed a new mom. The mom, if she was okay, then she needed a new husband. That's the way they treated me.
Mm-hmm.
Society was treating me like I was no good. I was horrible. And the best thing for me and for society would just lock me up, throw away the key. Mm. And so they were going to adopt out my kids. The foster parent was trying to make that happen. And so it was a horrible thing that even my wife was going through. And she's like, Matt, we're getting ready to go to court. They're going to adopt out our kids. I'm like, well, didn't you do everything that you said that you're supposed to do? And she said, yeah. And I was like, and they're still trying to adopt the kids? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, she's like, they're coming over. They were going to have this meeting. And I was like, well, what time is the meeting? She told me. I was like, well, I'm going to call home. I want to talk to this lady. And she said, well, what are you going to tell them? I'm like, well, what does it matter? They're going to take our kids anyway. I might as well just go ahead and let them have it. And so she's like, okay, she agreed to it. And that they come over, they have the meeting, and I call and I tell her, I was like, listen, lady, I'm telling you, I know what you did. I know what this other lady did. And she's like, what's that? I said, here's what happened. Boom. And I told her, you guys knew that that this doctor didn't look at the x-rays. You knowingly and willingly submitted evidence that you know was false. We've got the affidavit to show probable cause and the documents stamped from the prosecutor's office, from the records written down from the doctors. We got them all compared. We're having the state police investigate this. This is illegal. You can't. This is obstruction of justice. You're a professional. You can't do this type of stuff. It's illegal. And we're going to try to have you arrested. And, we're doing everything we can to make sure that you lose your job over this. We will win this case, and you're going to have serious problems. We're filing lawsuits on everybody. And she's like, well, I don't know about all that. And I'm like, I'm telling you, watch and see what happens. And she's like, okay. And you do what you got to do. We'll do what we got to do. I'm like, okay, that's fine. And then Jamie's like, well, thanks a lot, Matt. You know that. And I'm like, well, they're going to do whatever they're going to do anyway. And so I was like, I'll call you back before we go to court. I'm praying. I've got a relationship with God at this point. I asked God to help. She said, okay. She's crying. And I was like, all right, well, so I called up the day before she was supposed to go to court. And she said, Matt, I've been waiting for you to call. She's like, you're not going to believe what happened. I'm like, what happened? She said, after you got off the phone, the lady left. They called me back an hour later, and they told me that they were completely closing the case, and I'd have the kids back on Friday. She got the kids back, and they completely closed the case. And I was like, that's what happens. I was like, she needed to know what was going on, and she got afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And later on, if I don't tell you now, I'll forget. Later on, the Lord spoke back to me, spoke to me. He said he wanted to revisit this case. And I had an attorney. He's still working on some things pro bono for me. And what they're trying to do is to go back and get everything completely wiped off my record. So that's what he's doing. But he got all the records from Child Protective Services. And, and the key thing was, he's like, well, you failed the polygraph. I don't know. I want to help you. You failed the polygraph. You failed the polygraph. And I was like, yeah, but they told me I passed it. He only failed me because of the way that I behaved. And so he's like, and he's going through and he's like, I can't see any record that you actually took a polygraph. The only record I see is where you're actually saying it in court that you took it. I was like, I told you that I took it. Well, he goes through the whole Child Protective Services and he goes through and he finds one sticky note. On it, he wrote that they were write down that Jamie asked the results of Jamie was my wife at the time, asked them about the results of the polygraph. Inside the documentation in the folder, there was no evidence that I even took a polygraph. No bill, no results, no anything. And he's like, Matt, I believe you. And I was like, well, what do you think that means? He said, Matt, if you would have failed that polygraph, it would have been written all over everything. And he said, and I said, and because it's not there, I was like, yeah, I passed it. And I was like, not only that, but they're getting rid of the fact that I passed it. That's what they're doing. And he would not admit to that. He did not want to admit to that, but he knows that's exactly what took place. Mm-hmm. I passed that thing. All those were in my favor, and they went through, and that's what they looked at. They looked at me like I was a no good drug addict, and that the best thing for my wife and my kids was for them to find another husband and to find another dad. That's exactly what happened. That's why it's so important for me to tell the details. As embarrassing as it was, parents do that stuff all the time. They'll accidentally sit down without watching, and so that stuff happens. Accidents happen, things like that happen. I'm embarrassed about it, but it happens to sighted people too. So, I'm not just, I shouldn't have lied. That was the thing I did wrong. Maybe I should have called the hospital and called the ambulance or whatever. There's all kinds of things that I wish I could and would have did different, but it happened. But that's why I'm so honest about what took place, because people really won't appreciate what God did for me if they don't have all those details and how specific God was when he spoke. Because when he told me to go get the medical records, that's where all the evidence was that literally set me free.
Because we don't want anything to jeopardize Eric's effectiveness in his studies or in his situation, we have chosen to conceal his real name and many of the details which make this story so absolutely mind-blowing. But as a very broad follow-up, we will tell you that after Eric became grounded in church and his life was totally redirected and set on a new path, he attended a Bible college, where he graduated with a degree in biblical studies. He then went to another university in his state where he received a master's degree in divinity. Following these amazing events, he then followed the voice of God and went to another country to go to school to study ancient languages. And upon arriving, through a series of very interesting events, found his birth ethnicity was actually 50% of the nation where he was studying. This has opened many more doors for his studies. He's received a master's degree in an ancient language. He has become proficient in 2 other ancient languages, and he is presently working toward finishing his PhD in this country on a full ride scholarship. He's planted a church. He's now a field representative for his organization. And I was privileged to attend his wedding following the recording of this podcast. I was able to meet his daughter and one of his sons, along with his new wife, who seems just as excited as Eric about this new chapter in their lives. There are so many details not included in this podcast. But if you can hear this story and then grasp the scope of the brilliant mind Eric has put to full use for the kingdom of God instead of a life of drugs and degradation, you may be close to understanding the modern-day miracle story you've just heard. Just know this: not one of us is outside the reach of an amazing, loving, ever-seeking God. Whether you are in jail, in rehab, in the middle of addiction, or in a pig pen, there's hope for you. You can be blind or lame or challenged in whatever way you can think of, and there is an amazing future for you if you will just assume responsibility, totally submit to God, and dare to fly.